Hey friends, this is Marilyn from tarotclarity.com, and I hope you're not getting too sick of the Sola Busca rabbit hole that I've gone in. The first two videos, which I'll link below, are just my own personal observations with my very limited resources with a Google Translate and whatever I can find on the internet regarding words or people from Roman time. I didn't look up anything at other Sola Busca websites or anything like that because I don't really want to use somebody else's feelings or somebody else's interpretation. When I look at cards, I genuinely try to come to my own conclusions, even if my sources or resources are limited, and even if my understanding is limited. That's how I grow, because I start at a base, and as I learn, I add and build onto it. At any rate, when I did my first two videos on the Sola Busca, and I was only focusing on the Triumph cards, I think I mentioned that the only time that I ever did a video on the Sola Busca was to compare my two publications of the Sola Busca. And that turns out that it wasn't even correct. I didn't even make any previous videos on the Sola Busca. I had purchased these two decks quietly, and then just kept them and looked at them, and I never did anything with them on video. And so I think it's time that I do my side-by-side comparison between the only two Sola Busca decks that I have. Now, I know there are better copies of the Sola Busca. I'm sure Giordano Berti has a beautiful copy. And I know Wolfgang Mayer did a publication a number of years ago, which is also considered to be a quintessential copy. But when I purchased my copies, it was mostly just because I just wanted to have a copy. I just wanted to have a decent copy of the deck for historic reference. Now, the first copy that I bought was the Illuminating Ancient Tarots by Lo Scarabeo. And at the time, this was the only copy of the Sola Busca that was available. There wasn't any other copy. This predates anybody else's copy, as far as I was aware, 1995. And I didn't even get it in 95. By the time I got it, I believe that it was already out of print because it wasn't very popular, because nobody bought it, I guess. So by the time I was able to afford this, once I finally had like an empty nest, because remember when I had children, it didn't matter how much I wanted something. If I couldn't afford it, I couldn't afford it. But by the time I was able to afford this deck that was by then out of print, my children were out of the house. So I wanted a copy, and I knew it was not a facsimile copy, just like many of the Lo Scarabeo decks that are written in multiple languages. Those are often based on earlier decks. They didn't really come out with a facsimile kind of deck. So I bought this. And at the time, because it was out of print, it was the most expensive deck I've ever paid for, because it was out of print. And now I think you can get it for nothing, because there's so many, since this time, there's so many other Sola Busca copies that for the same amount of money, you could buy a beautiful copy, So who would want to pay for a little deck like this, except that it is out of print. And for some people who might be card collectors, it may be of interest. The second deck that I purchased, and I purchased it again, once the Sola Busca started to become published more frequently. I bought it also by Lo Scarabeo. This one was from the Anima Antiqua series because it was more of a facsimile deck, whereas the other one was more of a recreation copy. Now, I'm going to do a side-by-side. Today, I'll just do the Triumph cards side-by-side, and then I'll do the pip cards and the court cards side by side for another day. And one thing I think it will illustrate is how it's sometimes good to have a deck that is based on a real deck, an authentic deck, but maybe it cleans it up a little bit and it makes it a little easier to see. But then it's also really good to have a facsimile or a close facsimile of a deck, because then you can really see the nuance that maybe the recreation deck didn't quite capture. Now, as I mentioned when I was doing my first two videos, the first Lo Scarabeo deck gave us a cheat sheet, and in the cheat sheet that it gave us, it kind of force fit the 22 Triumph cards in the same exact order of the cards as we know them. For example, okay, Motto was already labeled 0, so that was an easy fit. We know that that was number, without number, and we know that it was the Fool. But some of them, as we go further along, and I'll comment at that time, don't seem to be a good fit for the typical card of that number. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So here we have the two mottos. They're very similar. The reproduction just seems to make it a little more crystal clear. I might miss a few details, like we missed this thing behind his foot or his boot. You see that? I don't know what that is. Is it a bone? It's missing here. Oh, wow, look at that. His foot looks peculiar here, doesn't it? Very strange. And the motto, even if it didn't have 0 on it, and even if it didn't have the name motto on it, we would identify it as the Fool. We would be able to recognize this as the Fool, because there's enough characteristics similar to other tarot decks. Panfilio. Now you see here the biggest difference between the facsimile deck and the recreation deck is the detail in the sword. They don't even try to fake it over here. It does seem to be pointing at something, perhaps the card that comes next. And that reminds me of one of my more recent commenters who jumped in the discussion down below. And as I mentioned yesterday, you should read some of my commenters, my viewers' comments, because some of them add wonderful insight into the discussion. Anyway, I think her name was Louise, 8273. And Louise shared that the posthumio, where the Patrick viewer commented that he thought maybe, or they thought that it was a representative of the Judgment card because it represents post-death, right, post-mortem. But Louise came by to comment and say, well, maybe what this is representing is more like a legacy or a heritage. And it would make sense that it was only number 2 because it's not as significant as the resurrection or the judgment, the last judgment, which makes a lot of sense to me. And like Patrick, Louise thinks that this was probably a torch, even though it doesn't quite look like a torch here, because it might be a torch, representing lighting the, keeping the flames of one's ancestors going, kind of thing. Which sounds reasonable to me. Now, I don't know how it really connects to the female pope, but it does satisfy that it's, it fits as an early sequential concept. And this is the one that I identified as the evil eye, or having an evil eye. It probably represented other things, but an aspect of it was the evil eye, since obviously there's no evil eye in the regular tarot canon. But it was followed by this guy. And if you want to know what I'm referencing between these two cards, go see the other video, part 2. My conversation on these two cards happens rather early, and you may find it interesting. I commented on Catulo, or Catalyst, who happened to have been a poet who did racy poetry, and I think Patrick responded that this was a folio, which was some type of pendulum or some kind of meter or some kind of device, perhaps for representing timing. And as far as catching in details, like here is a shape on the leg here. Here, you don't really get a sense of what it is, but here, you get more. I get more of a sense that this is a wound or an injury to this leg. Whereas here, I don't even know if that is the leg or what that is. So sometimes a facsimile deck really picks up on nuance, and it just makes, it just picks up on very subtle clues. Sexto, the 6th card, may or may not represent the lover, as it comes following a card that represented a poet who wrote love poems that were explicit. So it's possible that this is the lover. So we see something going on his chest or his armor. We see it here too. So it's not left out. Now, it doesn't appear as though the 6th is on. There it is on the bottom down here. And the earlier Lo Scarabeo put the 6 here, but the original card has it here. Now the expression on the faces, in this particular one is close-ish, but this one's face is a little longer. Some people think this may represent the emperor. I kind of think it represents the chariot, because it reminds me of the chariot. We've seen chariots in Italian decks that were similar to this before. Plus he's got the wreath of a victor. Nerone, who seems to be referencing Emperor Nero, who was a wicked man. This is card 8. If it were to be referencing the typical canon, number 8 would be justice. But I don't think Nero was known for his justice. He was known for his cruelty. And I do discuss some of his cruelty in the first video, part 1, if you care to hear about it. Falco, which, as number 9 card, seems to, if it were to coincide with the typical order, would coincide with the hermit or the hunchback, but it doesn't quite seem to represent that to me. There are other cards. There's another card, at least one other card, that seems to be a clearer reference to the hermit than this. Now, Falco, I think, means falcon or falconer, and he almost does look like somebody who's waiting for something to return from the sky. And in 1491, he wouldn't be looking for a jet or an airplane or anything like that. He'd probably be looking for a bird to return. I do appreciate that the embellishment of ribbons is generally truthfully reproduced in this deck. They may not always get all the facial features exactly right or some of the other little subtle things right, but they usually get those types of details right. Like here, it almost looks like he's got some kind of slipper shoe on. Here, he looks more barefoot, but it's pretty ambiguous in both. And I do think it's reasonable to believe that Venturio represented the Wheel of Fortune or was a similar card for the same concept. Now we have the wings of Mercury on his feet. Venturio meaning venture, or the young man venturing forth, perhaps for his fame and fortune in life. Again, the 10 does not appear in the same, okay, the 10 appears down here in the facsimile as it does here, but then the earlier reproduction also puts it in a more prominent spot. Oh, and obviously, this deck took liberties with putting the backs. I think this is more in keeping with what the backs generally look like. Maybe on marbleized paper. Excuse me. Tullio. I forget what the Latin root for that was or what the Latin word was. But he represents the 11th card, which I haven't dug into this one, so I don't really know what I am thinking about Tullio. I probably looked up the word and now can't remember what Tullio was referencing, but in the more typical canon, the 11th card would represent fortitude. So this is Carbone, which I indicated in the first video that there's 3 cards that do show celestial things in the sky, and this one is one of them. This one is the only card that shows the moon, and the word carbone meaning dark or charcoal, right? So it would be out of sequence, but could this possibly be referencing the moon? Here we have one that's got this, the only card that's got the star. Now it's 13, so that would usually be associated with death. And we do have a depiction that sort of is reminiscent of dying. I'm not really sure what this says. I think I did read it and I've forgotten, unfortunately. Catone, I looked that one up too. But again, we see a star, and it's the only depiction of a star in the deck. And it does seem that the Sola Busca bothers to have 3 celestial things in the sky: the moon, the star, and the sun. I'm not sure if I passed the sun yet. I may have passed, oh, no, it's coming up. So, I don't know if this was in some way, supposed to be relating to the star and this was supposed to be relating to the moon. Plus whatever other details or references within these cards. This might be referencing the star, but then there's a story, behind this, Now, could it be representing death and then taking the opportunity to put it with the star because, there's like an eternity with the star, and maybe there's an eternity after death too. So it could be a loose combination of the two cards, right? It could represent simultaneously the star and death. Now, I'm not a Sola Busca scholar, and I'm not a scholar, period. I'm just like an armchair enthusiast who's been looking at these cards or tarot cards in general for, for about 50 years. And most of the observations I make are my own. It's not like I haven't read other people's ideas or thoughts, especially back in the early days when I was starting, because I had an insatiable appetite for learning things. But the more cards I purchased and the more that I looked at them, the less I had to read, because I was able to compare cards myself. I didn't have to depend on other scholars' observations of cards that they had access to and they were able to learn from, right? And this being a reference to Bacchus, he also has an atypical foot, which we see in the devil. We see atypical, and this is like, if it's a reference to Bacchus, it's kind of like an Antichrist kind of character. So is he representing the devil? I don't know. He's card number 14. And in I think it was the Budapest Tarot, the devil was 14. And the tower that followed it was 15. But this card that's 15 doesn't seem to be representing the tower at all. I mean, he could be reminiscent of an emperor. He doesn't have crossed legs, but he does appear in profile. He does have a shield. And the name Metello is probably referencing something that a 15th century audience would clearly recognize. Here is Olivo, who has the sun. Now, because there's a little darkness, that it could be representing like some type of celestial event that involves the sun. And you'll notice, okay, here's a case in point where the facsimile card has a detail that we don't have here. They just kind of fudge it with a cloud, right? But here the cloud is a very specific shape. And the expressions are quite different. This guy is smiling. He seems a little happy. This guy just has a doofus look on his face, doesn't he? But in any case, in my first video, I made a case of saying that I don't think that this card represents the tower in the typical sequence of cards, because we have the sun, and we have somebody who looks happy, frankly, plus the word Olivo, which suggests peace, or, reference to the olive tree or branch or something. So this is probably a griffin. Now, this is the card that I thought might have been referencing the devil. Excuse me. Because, as I've mentioned in other videos, that the devil frequently has wings not of virtue, wings of darkness, bat-like wings. I'm so sorry. And, he's praying to perhaps what would be considered idolatry. I don't know. And there may be a temptation to think of him as the hermit. However, when we see this next card, I think this next card at number 18 makes a better case for being the hermit. Because we have an older gentleman who's hunched over, not quite with a hunchback, but he does have something peculiar going on in his back. And he's got a torch, which was later, in the earlier days, it was an hourglass, but it did seem to morph into a torch. Maybe as a reference to Diogenes in the French cards. I'm just trying to catch if there's any missed detail. Lentulo. The number 19 card. Now this is the card. Oh my gosh, I do apologize. That I make a case for representing the Tower card, and that's number 20. So it's a few cards beyond either of the cards that I might consider the devil. And, you know, why would the Tower card come right before the World card? But of all the cards in the Sola Busca Triumph order, this seems to be the closest one to depict the Tower. Plus, it's got the reference to Nimrod, you know, Nimbroto, who happened to be the king who facilitated the creation of the Tower of Babel, which is, if you saw my video on the Tower, you know, my point being that I thought that the Tower in the Tarot deck was probably based on the Tower of Babel. And here in the 1491 deck of Sola Busca, they seem to be making that same reference. So at least in 1491, there seems to be a reference to the Tower card as the Tower of Babel. It's not referenced like this in other decks, but this is an early deck, and it kind of is referencing that. But what throws me is that the devil doesn't appear right before it. And then Louise, 8273, really made me feel more comfortable with, you know, the Nebuchadnezzar card being the ultimate card. It threw me when I saw it because I thought, why are they glorifying a king that destroyed the temple at Jerusalem? But Louise pointed out to me that it's probably representing the New Jerusalem. You know, it's a reference to the old Jerusalem being destroyed, but then the new Jerusalem coming forth, which would have been representative of, you know, after the final judgment, the place where Christians would go to be with Christ in heaven. And so that seems to be a much better message and a much better understanding of what this card could mean in the World card than the one I came up with, which I discussed in yesterday's video, part 2. So I hope you found this interesting. I will do the pip cards in my next video, and I may or may not pull out the 1910 deck by Pamela Coleman Smith and Arthur Edward Waite on a few occasions to compare, to see what influence the Sola Busca may have had on that 1910 deck. Well, I know there was a 1909 deck, but I'm going to use the 1910 deck that I have by Conrad Steen, which I believe is the closest, from what my understanding, is the closest to the publication that came out in 1910. And the 1910 was the preferred publication by Arthur Edward Waite, because he was not satisfied with the 1909. At any rate, until this next video, I hope you enjoyed this one. Peace. Stay well. Oh, please give me thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Please share my channel. Please tell your friends about me. Buy me a cup of coffee. I'd appreciate it. You can give me a super thanks. You know, I do appreciate any support in allowing me to keep my channel free. Any support that I get from you guys enables me to buy the decks to be able to bring educational videos to you. Thanks.